senior fellow at Defense Priorities. All right, Davis, your take on what we're going to see very shortly in Gaza.
It's going to be a lot harder than what people are thinking. You may remember in 2009, Obama sent the U.S. Army into Afghanistan and said they were going to destroy the Taliban. And you see how that worked out. And the reason why is similar, because once the Israeli forces go in, how do they know who's a Hamas fighter as opposed to just some man that happens to be standing there? Almost everybody's armed with an AK-47. And unless Israel is going to literally kill everyone, they're going to have to find some effective way to be discriminating in who they shoot. Otherwise, they're going to gain more enemies than they'll ever get rid of the Hamas. And that's one of the biggest difficulties I see Israel have. But then I'll also add one other thing. Look, the Israeli army has not been trained for this kind of sophisticated urban warfare. They've been trained in other things over time. And it's going to be a lot harder for them to operate in a pretty high learning curve than many people may think.
Why hasn't the IDF trained in urban combat?
Because that's not what they ever have expected, and they haven't done it other than a handful of incursions here and there, and those were targeted. But in terms of like waging siege warfare in a city, I mean, they haven't ever done it. And it's a very different skill set because you're eradicating or trying to eradicate an enemy force that's hard to identify. But that's just something that Israel hasn't done. Almost nobody's done that other than like Bakhmut in the Russia-Ukraine war.
I really feel like the international community has to step in there and show more consistency. What say you?
I think that the international community is really wrapped around making sure that innocent people don't get hurt anymore in this. And we saw it with the barbarity from the Hamas in those innocent people at the concert. I mean, it's still hard to get my head wrapped around that. And I think there's pretty universal condemnation on the Hamas. I think where there might be some room for additional viewpoints is that the Palestinian people are being victimized really because the Hamas is within them, but they're still being killed in large numbers, up to 600 children. And, you know, I don't think anybody wants to see any more of that.
It would seem to me that in a circumstance like this, the idea of trying to protect the innocent and yet rooting out the actual problem, the fighters from Hamas, this is fraught with peril. How prepared do you suspect the Israelis are for this eventuality?
That's exactly the right question. There are two factors we got to take a look at. One is the Israeli side. The second is the Hamas side.
Yeah.
On the Israeli side, they're probably not very well prepared for this because they are not trained to execute these really complex operations to siege a city on a large scale like this, where there's a large enemy force and they don't even know where they're going to be, because the intelligence required for such an operation is extraordinary, and they just don't have it because they don't have the time for all that. And that's going to be a problem. The second issue is on the Hamas side. You better know that just like they were very thorough in preparation for the offensive and their attack, they're also very prepared for the defense. They know this terrain like nobody's business because they live it. And you can bet that they've got this thing very well booby-trapped and probably IEDs, and they got kill sacks set up, all kinds of defenses that's going to make it very, very difficult for the Israeli Defense Force. And I think people need expectation management that this is likely not going to be fast, clean, or easy.
When you're dealing with an insurgency that will embed itself within civilian populations, you've got your hands full.
This just really underscores the scope of what we're talking about here. You talked about that they're trying to get 1 million people out of this part of the Gaza Strip, and they're not going to succeed. They're not going to get all those people out of there. So there's going to be a lot in the area.
Yeah.
And that also shows you how massive what we're talking about is. This is not like the Second Battle of Fallujah in 2004, which the U.S. Marines spent, I think, 2 or 3 months having to do this same kind of operation. Mm-hmm. Now you're talking about orders of magnitude larger. And of course, there's many, many more Hamas fighters in here than there were insurgents that we faced at that particular battle. And these guys, you can count on it that they are very well stocked. They've been preparing this for a long time. They know the terrain, and I just can't imagine a more difficult task for the Israeli Defense Forces.
I want to stay with you for just a second, Colonel, and I want to get your reaction to something that Defense Secretary Austin said yesterday. He was asked more or less, at what point do we have to consider a contingency here, in particular if Hezbollah involves itself more forcefully in this battle?
Should Israel be attacked from the north, from Hezbollah in Lebanon, will you be willing to exercise your force and join the fighting?
I won't speculate on anything that could happen in the future. I will just tell you clearly that the United States will continue to support Israel's right to defend itself.
If Hezbollah gets involved, how big of a problem are we looking at?
I think that's one of the most important things for an American audience to understand right now is to what's at stake and the context that this whole thing is being fought in. Because you have, I believe it was within the last 12 hours, you have some of the Hezbollah leaders saying that their red line to attack is if the IDF does go in large numbers into the Gaza Strip. They said if that was the case, they are going to open another northern flank on this so that Israel will have a two-front war. Now, whether they do it or whether they don't remains to be seen, or if it's just a bluff. But if they do, then you're going to have a big problem. If the United States does engage, then the next part of this so-called axis of resistance, which is Iran, Syria, a number of these other violent groups in that region, have said their red line is if the U.S. gets involved directly on the ground, either with Hezbollah or against Hamas. And if that happens, then this whole thing could explode into a regional war, and that is not in America's interest. And I think we need to do everything in our power to keep this contained to the Gaza Strip.